I thought starting a business would be hard. I expected product problems, money problems, customer problems, and the occasional moment where I'd sit alone at my desk wondering if I'd just ruined my life. The normal entrepreneur stuff. What I didn't expect was an ivory-colored envelope from a law firm. Inside that envelope were three words every new business owner hopes they never read: cease and desist. At that point, my company was barely alive. We didn't have stability. We didn't have cash reserves. We didn't have systems. We didn't have momentum. But apparently, we had a lawsuit. So one moment, I was a young entrepreneur trying to build a machine, find customers, and keep the lights on. The next moment, I had 48 hours to respond in court. 48 hours. That's when I learned a brutal lesson. Sometimes the biggest threat to a young company isn't the market. It isn't the customer. It isn't even the economy. Sometimes the biggest threat is the legal fight that walks through the door, grabs your time, drains your cash, hijacks your focus, and quietly becomes the business. Welcome, or hopefully welcome back to Lessons from a Reluctant Entrepreneur, a series based on anecdotes from my book, The Reluctant Entrepreneur, Anatomy of a Business Startup from Uncertainty to Unstoppable. In the last episode, we talked about starting before you're ready. I shared the story of my first official day in business, sitting at a used desk, very used desk, surrounded by all the visible signs of a company: a logo, phones, business cards, office supplies, used furniture everywhere, and tools, while quietly wondering what in the world had I just done. We also talked about my first customer meeting when I had no brochure, no photo, no specifications, and certainly no product. The customer slid a blank piece of paper across the table and said, "Draw it." That's it. Draw it. That moment helped pull the product out of my imagination and into the real world. Today, I want to talk about what happened shortly after that. A lesson I learned before my company had any real stability, before we had any meaningful cash reserves, before we had systems, before we had momentum, and before I had the experience to understand what was about to happen. Today's lesson is about lawsuits. More specifically, what happens when the lawsuit becomes the business. When I started my company, I expected challenges. I expected product challenges, sales challenges, money challenges. I expected normal difficulties that come with turning an idea into a real company. What I didn't expect was to receive a cease and desist letter from an attorney within the first few months of starting a business. But to understand why that letter arrived, we need to go back to the word that started all of this. The word fine. That was the word my former boss used when he rejected my idea for the next generation product. I pitched the concept. He said no. I told him I thought it was a mistake. And he responded with that one dismissive, four-letter word, fine. At the time, it felt final. It felt like the door had closed, slam closed. But the strange thing about closed doors is that sometimes they don't stop the idea. They just force the idea to find another way out of the building. So that's what happened. I left. I started my own company. I took the concept he'd rejected and began turning it into a real product. And then something interesting happened. When my former boss saw that I'd actually built the product he turned down, the idea apparently didn't look quite so wrong anymore. From my perspective, it seemed like he had a change of heart. Funny how that works. An idea can look terrible when it's just sitting in someone else's head, but once that same idea has steel, wires, pumps, controls, and customers looking at it, suddenly it starts looking a little less terrible. The product he dismissed as a bad idea suddenly looked a lot more attractive once someone else had taken the risk, done the work, and brought it to life. That's when the situation changed. It was no longer just an idea he'd rejected. It was now a real product. It was being built by a new company, and that new company was mine. That's when the ivory-colored envelope arrived with the law firm's name printed on it. Inside was a letter marked personal and confidential, although there was nothing personal or confidential about what would follow. I opened the letter and quickly realized I was reading something far more serious than ordinary correspondence. The words that jumped out were cease and desist. At that point in my life, I'd never been involved in a lawsuit. I'd never been deposed. I'd never seen the inside of a courtroom as a defendant. I'd never had my personal and business records subpoenaed. I'd never experienced the legal system as a business weapon. That was about to change. My former employer accused me of a long list of wrongdoing, 12 causes of action in total. Breach of contract, breach of fiduciary responsibility, fraud, unfair business practices, and several other accusations that sounded terrifying even when I didn't fully understand them. And trust me, when you're 32 years old, broke, building a company from scratch, and reading a legal document filled with words like fiduciary, fraud, and temporary restraining order, your first thought isn't, let me just calmly evaluate the merits of this claim. Your first thought is usually something like, oh my God, am I going to prison? I wasn't, but the document certainly had a flair for drama. They also sought a temporary restraining order to prevent us from exhibiting our new product at an upcoming trade show. That part mattered. For a young company, a trade show can be more than just a marketing event. It can be oxygen. Remember, this was a time before the internet and instant access to information. We didn't have websites, social media, YouTube channels, LinkedIn posts, email campaigns, or online demos. Back then, if you wanted the industry to know that you existed, you had to show up at a trade show with a machine, a booth, a stack of brochures, and the desperate hope that people would stop walking long enough to talk to you. That show could be the first and only real opportunity to show the world we existed. It could generate leads, orders, credibility, and momentum. We needed that show. We needed to be seen. We needed the industry to know there was a new player in the market. And now, just as we were preparing to introduce our product, my former employer was trying to stop us from showing up. We had 48 hours to respond. 48 hours. What's that about? One moment I was a new entrepreneur trying to build a machine, find customers, and keep the lights on. The next moment I was hiring an attorney and preparing to appear before a judge. That's one of the strange things about entrepreneurship. The problem you expect isn't always the problem that shows up. You may think the challenge is engineering, sales, financing, or hiring. Then suddenly the challenge is legal survival, because apparently starting a company wasn't stressful enough on its own. In those early days, I still had plenty of ego, bravado, arrogance, and ignorance. Those aren't always admirable qualities, but in that moment, they gave me enough defiance to keep moving. I believed this was a battle of right versus wrong, truth versus lie, David versus Goliath. I was angry, I was scared, I was confused, but I also was determined. We hired an attorney and went to court the next day to fight the temporary restraining order. The goal of the restraining order was simple: keep us from exhibiting at the trade show. If they could stop us from showing the product, they could stop our momentum before it even began. Thankfully, the judge refused to grant the temporary restraining order, and for the moment, we were safe. For the moment. And by safe, I mean we were still broke, still terrified, still being sued, and still trying to build a product under legal attack. But in startup terms, that counts as a pretty good day. The trade show was still alive, but the lawsuit was only beginning. I learned very quickly that lawsuits are nothing like television courtroom dramas. On television, the legal story is dramatic, fast-moving, and neatly resolved in 1 hour. There's usually a shocking witness, a clever attorney, one dramatic objection.
Objection, Your Honor.
And by the end, everyone knows who was right. Real lawsuits are not like that. Real litigation is slow, deliberately slow, intrusive, disruptive, and expensive. It doesn't simply attack the issue being argued. It spreads to every corner of the business like legal mold. Our vendors were contacted. Our customers were contacted. Employees, friends, and family members were deposed. Bank records were subpoenaed. Customer lists, vendor lists, personal financial reports and business financial records were all demanded. Everything became open for inspection. The lawsuit didn't sit neatly in a file folder. It took over. That's what I mean when I say the lawsuit became the business. Suddenly, I wasn't spending all of my time building the company. I was defending the company. I wasn't just thinking about product development, sales operations, and customers. I was thinking about attorneys, discovery requests, subpoenas, court dates, legal fees, and whether I could survive long enough to make it to trial. A lawsuit can become a second business inside your business. But unlike the real business, it produces no revenue. It consumes cash. It consumes time. It consumes attention. It consumes confidence. It consumes sleep. It consumes emotional energy. And when your company is young, those are exactly the resources you can't afford to lose. It's like opening a second company where the only product is anxiety and the only customer is your attorney. One of the most painful realizations was that the lawsuit didn't appear to be about justice. It appeared to be about survival, ours specifically. The process itself became the weapon. The goal wasn't necessarily to win the trial. The goal was to make sure we could never make it that far. That was a hard lesson. Sometimes in business, people don't have to beat you in the marketplace if they can drain you before the marketplace decides. The discovery process lasted for about a year. During that time, both sides demanded documents, interviewed people, inspected products, and interrupted each other's business. When we received discovery requests that we believed were excessive or irrelevant, we objected. But even objecting costs money. A special master was assigned to resolve discovery disputes, and every objection cost thousands of dollars. That's when I learned another charming feature of litigation. Even saying, "This seems ridiculous," comes with an invoice. Eventually, we stopped fighting all of those discovery requests. We just didn't have the money. Whatever they asked for, they received. Now, that's a terrible feeling for a young business. You want to protect sensitive information. You want to protect customers. You want to protect vendor relationships. You want to protect the company's private financial reality. But at some point, you realize protecting the information may cost more than just turning it over. So you give them the documents and you try and stay alive. During that time, I called my former boss and suggested we meet and maybe try and settle the lawsuit. I told him the last thing I wanted was to go to trial. He laughed and said something that revealed the strategy more clearly than any legal document could have. He said, "If you think you're going to make it to trial, you're a fool." That sentence told me everything. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a countdown. Could we survive long enough to have our day in court? That became the question. Within a few months, the investment capital was gone. The money that was supposed to fund parts, rent, utilities, payroll, and the actual building of the company was now being redirected to the attorney. With no line of credit available and our startup capital exhausted, the company had to survive on organic cash flow. Organic cash flow makes it sound like we had a thoughtful financial strategy. We didn't. We were operating hand to mouth. We were fortunate to be selling machines. Sales were slow at first, but steady. The proceeds from one sale helped us buy parts for the next machine and still pay the attorney. It wasn't a healthy business model, but it was a survival model. Then something happened that sounds good until you understand the cash flow behind it. Sales picked up. Normally, that would be cause for celebration. More orders mean more revenue, and more revenue means the business is working, right? Not always. I learned that rapid growth can create cash problems, especially when you're already financially strained. With the proceeds from one machine, we suddenly needed to buy parts and labor for 3 more machines. The more we sold, the less cash we had. Growth wasn't solving the cash problem, it was intensifying it. That's a lesson many small business owners learn the hard way. Sales aren't cash. Revenue isn't profit. Growth isn't always healthy. A growing company can still run out of money. Eventually, we had no money to buy parts. Credit cards were maxed out. The bank account was near zero. I remember scouring office garbage cans looking for stamps that hadn't been canceled by the post office so I could cut them off used envelopes, tape them to new envelopes, and send brochures to prospective customers. Now, let's face it, that's not a proud image, but it's an honest one. That was entrepreneurship at street level. Not the magazine cover version, not the conference stage version, not the motivational quote version, the real version. The version where you're trying to build a company while saving enough money to mail a brochure. Nothing says unstoppable founder quite like digging through trash for uncanceled postage. With no money to purchase parts, we had two choices: refuse orders or require a down payment. Actually, even calling it a choice gives us way too much credit. There was no real choice. We changed our payment terms immediately. 50% down with the order, balance net 30 days. At first, customers pushed back. They pushed back a lot. Of course they did. These weren't the standard terms they expected, but we had no room to negotiate. We didn't blink because we couldn't blink. And something surprising happened. We didn't lose a single order. That moment taught me something important. Sometimes the thing you were afraid to do is only frightening because you haven't done it yet. We feared asking for money down because we believed customers would say no. When survival required it, we asked, actually, we demanded, and they paid. That was a lesson I'd later forget and eventually have to relearn. Fear has a way of creating selective amnesia. During a crisis, we do what we must. Later, when the crisis passes, fear returns and convinces us we can't do the very thing that once saved us. But in that moment, the down payments kept us alive. Half of the down payment went toward parts, the other half went toward legal fees. When the balance was collected, the money was split between operations, more parts, and the attorney. We were operating at the very edge of the envelope, but somehow it worked. Eventually, the trial arrived. Both parties agreed to a bench trial, meaning there'd be no jury. A judge would hear the case and decide the outcome. And quite frankly, I was very relieved by that. Our judge was serious, focused, and uninterested in courtroom theatrics.
I want the truth!
He wanted the truth, not drama. And quite honestly, after a year of legal drama, I was perfectly happy to have someone in the room who wasn't interested in producing more of it. The trial lasted 8 full days. 4 days for the plaintiff to present their case, 4 days for us to present ours. I spent 2 days on the witness stand. I answered questions. I listened to accusations. I watched evidence, charts, photographs, declarations, and arguments move through the courtroom. Then it ended. Not with a dramatic ruling from the bench, not with music swelling in the background, not with someone shouting objection and everything became clear. The judge simply thanked both parties and said he'd mail the ruling within 30 days. 30 long days. Those 30 days were very difficult. Before the trial, I believed truth would prevail. After the trial, with nothing left to do but wait, I replayed everything in my head. Did I answer clearly? Did I look credible? Did I explain myself properly? Did I appear rational? Did I say too much? Did I say too little? When the testimony is over, the mind keeps testifying. About 30 days later, I received a call from my attorney while I was in the middle of a product demonstration with a prospective customer. We had won. I was found not liable on all counts. In fact, some of the plaintiff's allegations included provisions for mandatory attorney's fees, and the judge ordered them to pay us more than $60,000, about half of our legal costs. Now, that sounds like a great ending. It wasn't. Our actual legal fees were well over $100,000, so the $60,000 award didn't make us whole. But it mattered. It was real money. It was money the company desperately needed. And then, almost immediately, they filed an appeal. And that appeal froze the award. So now, after a year of litigation, after surviving discovery, depositions, legal bills, court appearances, trial preparation, and 8 days in court, we had won. But we still didn't get the money. My attorney explained that the appeal would take about 3 years to work its way through the appellate court. She also told me she believed we had a very strong chance of winning. That, of course, should have been comforting. It wasn't, because she also told me it would likely cost another $30,000 to $50,000 to fight the appeal. And even if we won, we wouldn't be able to recover that money. So let me translate that into entrepreneur language. We had just won the lawsuit. We had been awarded $60,000. But to maybe collect on that $60,000, we might have to spend another $30,000 to $50,000, wait for 3 more years, and keep paying attorneys, keep thinking about the case, keep dragging the company through the legal system, and keep delaying the work of rebuilding the business. That didn't feel like winning. That felt like being invited to the premiere of an extended version of a nightmare I'd already watched in full. Way against the advice of my attorney, I told her I wanted to settle. And the offer was simple. If they dropped the appeal, we dropped the $60,000 award. She had such a hard time understanding that. And from a legal perspective, I understood why. We had won. The court had awarded us money. We had a strong position. Why give it up? But I wasn't thinking like a lawyer. I was thinking like a business owner who needed to get his company out of the courtroom and back into the marketplace. And my reasoning was quite simple. The sooner we get out of the legal system, the sooner we can stop bleeding cash, stop feeding the distraction, and start rebuilding the financial health of the company. At some point, I had to decide what mattered more, being paid because we were right or getting free so we could rebuild. I chose free. As far as the lawsuit was concerned, justice prevailed. Truth was seen. And for a brief moment, we did celebrate. But the celebration didn't last long, because winning the lawsuit doesn't erase what the lawsuit had cost. Yeah, we won legally, but the process had drained cash, time, focus, and energy from a young company that needed every ounce of those resources. We survived, but we didn't walk away untouched. We were bruised, damaged, in debt, and forced to rebuild. That's another truth entrepreneurs need to understand. Winning can be costly. Being right can be expensive. Justice can still arrive late. A favorable judgment doesn't return the lost sleep, the lost focus, the lost opportunities, or the emotional toll of living under a threat for a year. And yet, I wouldn't say the experience was without value. It taught me resilience. It taught me that a company can survive more than I thought it could. It taught me the importance of documentation, clarity, and professional guidance. It taught me that cash flow isn't an accounting concept. It's oxygen. It taught me that customers may accept stronger terms when the value is real. It taught me that survival sometimes requires doing the very thing fear told you not to do. It also taught me to be very careful with conflict. Let's face it, lawsuits are sometimes necessary. There are times when legal action just can't be avoided. There are times when a company has to defend itself. There are times when principle, protection, or survival requires a legal response. But no business owner should enter litigation casually. A lawsuit isn't just a legal event, it's a business event. It's a financial event. It's an emotional event. It's a leadership event. It affects the owner, the team, the customers, the vendors, and the company's ability to focus on its real purpose. Before you engage in a legal battle, you have to ask hard questions. What are we really trying to accomplish? What will this cost if we win? What will it cost if we lose? Can we survive the process? Is there another way to resolve this? Are we fighting the truth, or are we fighting because ego wants a trophy? That last question matters. Ego loves courtrooms. Ego loves being right. Ego loves the idea of having someone in authority declare victory. And ego, if we're honest, has never met a mirror it didn't like. But business owners have to be careful. The goal isn't just to win arguments. The goal is to build a healthy company. Sometimes those goals overlap. Sometimes they don't. In my case, we had to defend ourselves. We didn't choose the fight. The fight came to us. But even then, the experience changed how I looked at conflict, cash, growth, payment terms, and the fragility of a young company. Looking back, one of the biggest lessons is that the business must remain the business, even when crisis tries to take over. That's way easier said than done. When the lawsuit arrived, it demanded attention. It demanded cash. It demanded emotional energy. But the company still needed to sell. The product still needed to work. Customers still needed support. Vendors still needed payment. Employees still needed leadership. The lawsuit became part of the business, but it couldn't be allowed to become the whole business. That balance was difficult. I didn't always do it well, but somehow we kept moving, one order at a time, one down payment at a time, one legal bill at a time, one machine at a time. That's how survival often works, not in grand gestures, but in small acts of persistence. You answer the subpoena, you call the customer, you buy the parts, you pay what you can, you show up in court, you return to the office, you ship the machine, you keep going. And that's the fifth lesson from the reluctant entrepreneur. When a lawsuit becomes the business, it can drain more than money. It can drain focus, energy, confidence, and momentum. Sometimes you have to fight, but you must never forget what you're fighting to protect. The goal isn't just to win the lawsuit. The goal is to keep the business alive long enough to have a future after the lawsuit is over. In the next episode of Lessons from a Reluctant Entrepreneur, we'll talk about how fear makes expensive decisions. Shortly after I started the company, I made one of the most costly decisions of my early business life. I gave away 49% of the company, not because I was strategic, but because I was afraid. Well, I hope you found this episode helpful. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the Reluctant Entrepreneur podcast on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast app. There, you'll find interviews with entrepreneurs, a special series called Reluctant Lessons, where businesses went wrong, and this series, Lessons from a Reluctant Entrepreneur. If you'd like to get more information about the podcast, just visit reluctantentrepreneur.podcast.com. Thank you all so much for being here. I'll see you again on the next episode.